I want to get to Errol Barnett, our CBS News correspondent. He's also tracking the movements of the protesters in Charlotte. Errol, give us a sense of what you're seeing.
Vlad, what's interesting is that moments ago, about 10 or 15 minutes ago, I was showing you how protesters were staying in one intersection and then moving down a street to the right. Well, it appears as if by now they've circled around a few more blocks and ended up right where they started, moving in a new direction. So as this curfew has now come into effect, demonstrators have continued to kind of lap around downtown and some of the landmarks. However, even though they are not abiding by the curfew, and remember, it was only announced at about 9 p.m. Eastern, so about 3 hours before it came into effect. It's unclear if many of the demonstrators even realize there is a curfew. I don't hear any loud announcements coming from police via speakerphone right now, but there is a strong police presence. The interactions between protesters and police seems to be a peaceful one. I mean, I've seen demonstrators talking with National Guard members. Police officers are on motorcycles, or I should say bicycles, cycling behind the demonstrators, as well as these kind of small vehicles on the streets as well. So the demonstrations have continued. They've slightly petered out, but we are not seeing the same type of violence witnessed Wednesday evening. There are no windows that have been broken. There is no tear gas being deployed. The only tear gas I saw being deployed was when demonstrators moved onto the highway. And after demonstrators were moved off the 277, the riot police simply stood their ground. They didn't pursue demonstrators into parts of downtown. So at the moment, Vlad, with the curfew in effect, it seems as though protesters are still making laps and police are still showing force, but at this moment there are no violent clashes.
And that is certainly good news, Errol. A very welcoming bit of information to hear, given that last night it was a much different scene on the ground there in Charlotte, North Carolina. One person that was shot. Ultimately, that person sadly, tragically died late Thursday evening. But now, as we look at some of these images, we see police officers on bicycles. And again, as you pointed out, Errol, both sides, the protesters and the police officers, the posture for the most part is seemingly relaxed, even though this curfew has now gone into effect in Charlotte. And look, there was never an indication that when a curfew goes into effect, it's like turning on or off a light switch, that all of a sudden everybody has to get off the streets immediately. Clearly people are some distance away from their vehicles, some distance away from their homes. And so we can expect, as long as it remains peaceful, and we saw a pretty cool image just a little while ago from our producer Galat Thaler showing a protester fist bumping with several National Guardsmen. As long as the folks there continue to behave peacefully and to move away from where the guard and the police officers are asking them to move away from, that we can hopefully, knock on wood, expect that this night will not be a repeat of what we saw Wednesday night.
Yeah, Vlad, and you make a good point about the National Guard. They very well could have made the difference tonight. I mean, we'll wait and see if this peace holds and if there are no violent clashes now that the curfew is in effect. But if you remember yesterday, where I spoke with one demonstrator who described doing what happened tonight, moving around with the protesters from building to building. And what she told me is when the riot police came onto the scene and made their presence known, that was when the mood of demonstrators changed. They felt threatened in some way, and because they felt threatened, more of the demonstrators were likely to retaliate. Today, what we saw after the police chief, Ked Putney, said that he wants to see restraint on both sides, with the National Guard playing that role of really being a visible force in the downtown streets, it's allowed the riot police to stand back and to stay further away from downtown. As I mentioned, they only really moved onto demonstrators when demonstrators moved onto the main interstate. Once the protesters were off the highway, the riot police stood where they were. We've yet to see them come into the downtown streets. And as you say, the protesters having a much more friendly interaction with National Guardsmen than riot police, that may prove to be the key in keeping these demonstrations peaceful and keeping the police from needing to use force at a time when the citizens of this city feel that the police force is already too heavy-handed and they're suspicious of police tactics. So the National Guard, in many ways, could be saving the day in Charlotte.
And Errol, I spoke to a police official earlier today, and we talked somewhat about the tactics that police use in situations like this. And I think we were talking earlier about this. We were comparing and contrasting some of the other protests in American cities that we've seen over the last 2 years or so, specifically in Ferguson, Missouri, where police, as you just pointed out, the posture was extremely aggressive. They were using heavy weapons, tactical gear, getting in the faces of protesters, pointing weapons at protesters. That seemed to inflame the crowd. And then going forward, we had days and days and days of violent protests until the National Guard came into town. And here, as you point out, although the crowd is still on the streets and we are 17 minutes into that curfew that has gone into effect there in Charlotte, North Carolina, for the most part, this official telling me that as long as it remains peaceful, we should not expect to see the Charlotte Police Department acting in an aggressive manner with the protesters as they continue to make their way down the streets.
That's right. And there's another layer to all of this as well, which is the federal attention. You know, Attorney General Loretta Lynch made a statement today addressing the media on the bombings in New York and New Jersey, but she began by referencing Charlotte and said that while the Department of Justice will not be launching an independent investigation into the shooting of Keith Scott, she did say that they would be monitoring the situation closely and offering support where appropriate. So in many ways, that put the local police department, the mayor's office, and officials here on notice that the federal officials will be watching not only what happened earlier in the week, but will be watching how security officials here treat protesters in the aftermath as well. And as you mentioned, in other cities like Ferguson, heavy-handed responses by local officials to get demonstrators to go home really only has proven to backfire as far as infuriating more people, lowering the level of trust people have with the police, and furthering the gulf between the police and the communities they serve. So we are seeing a different sequence of events Thursday evening to Wednesday evening, and of course the fact that one person who was shot has now died in hospital. All of these things, that the Attorney General and the National Guard have almost calmed both sides down as we try and get to some kind of resolution into what has been a very difficult week for the city, and not to mention the family of Keith Scott as well.
Errol Barnett, our CBS News correspondent on the ground in Charlotte, North Carolina.